But yeah, so voice training, dun dun dun, and specifically looking more towards kind of masculine voices. So what's up with that, huh? But yeah, so we've got, hopefully you can see the kind of slideshow thingy majig I've got going. But we're just going to kind of be using that on the side, so we have a little bit more stuff to kind of refer back to maybe. Um, okay, cursor should be not super necessary, but also fine. So, mm, like, one of the first things that kind of like, becomes a little bit of a question when we're thinking about voice masculinization is whether testosterone is part of that picture or not. So, voice training for trans masc people is generally easier with testosterone, but it's definitely not kind of like a requirement. And some people will be on T and not actually necessarily feel like they need to voice train either. So it's kind of like a little bit person to person dependent. Some people will take T and not pass even with that, and then other people will pass without voice training at all as well. So there's kind of a little bit of a mix. So what does testosterone actually tend to do, kind of, I suppose, in second puberty, right? So it tends to lower pitch and increase vocal weight. So I might put this on YouTube. I haven't decided. It'll probably go on the server at the very least. But yeah, so none of the kind of chat is being kind of highlighted. It's just a slideshow anyway. But yeah, so what does it tend to do? It tends to like lower pitch and increase vocal weight. So like the voice tends to get kind of like louder and more intense perhaps, and kind of like tends to drift down in pitch. That's part of it. And this is kind of coming from, the vocal folds themselves literally kind of growing a little bit. Now, it doesn't necessarily have as a profound effect on other kind of vocal structures. So like changes in kind of like vocal size are a little bit like less likely to happen, though depending on if somebody takes it like early enough in their life, it might kind of have some impact. So what this kind of means in terms of voice training is that if you're on T, you might not have to worry about kind of like lowering pitch and increasing vocal weight as much. It might kind of play a lesser role. It doesn't change everything though. So like, you still have to work on vocal size stuff, and you still have to work on kind of like behaviors and habits that you've built up. So like things like customer service voice and stuff where your voice maybe might change quite a lot into a zone you don't particularly want it to. All of that stuff is still relevant. So what if you don't want to go on T or can't, or T is just not in the picture for some reason? So what do we want to kind of be aware of in that scenario? So voice training tends to take longer. You tend to want to kind of shift the view maybe a little bit more onto the long term. So rather than kind of like it being as much as a coordination task, it to some extent becomes a little bit of a task revolving around what is the word I'm looking for? Revolving around like long term, kind of like to some extent structural change. Obviously, you're not going to be changing the structure of your vocal tract or anything, but there are some studies to suggest that kind of like vocal use actually impacts kind of the vocal folds like size and kind of like yes, and can induce kind of structural changes a little bit. So we want to kind of bear that in mind a little bit. Now, another kind of big consideration in this regard is that like because T is not getting involved with like increasing kind of vocal weight and like lowering pitch, it means that you're kind of going to probably be spending a decent amount of time working on that, but it also kind of means that you might need to spend more time working towards kind of building up like fullness in the voice. So fullness is kind of like what we use, the term we use to describe the relationship between vocal weight and resonance. So like when it's full, it just kind of sounds normal for the most part. A voice kind of like this one is probably like full-ish, and again, a voice kind of like this one is probably full-ish. But like if you had something like this where it's kind of sounding hollow and empty, then that's kind of like a sign, for example, that your vocal weight is not enough to make that sound right. And kind of like, maybe some level like this where you've maybe increased the size, but other stuff hasn't kept up. You might come across something like this in voice training if you're pre-T. So it's a case of like working to increase that vocal weight. You might want to try and get louder, and you might want to try and bring that pitch down a little bit for the impact that has on vocal weight. And that tends to be a longer term kind of thing to work on, because vocal weight and pitch are kind of like a little bit tricky to like produce an immediate change. So another kind of note here is just that, vocal habits, once again, are relevant and definitely can contribute to how your voice sounds. And, truthfully, like, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to kind of get a huge kind of like depth of ranging that can kind of sound masculine, right? Morgan Freeman is probably going to be off the table for people who are pre-T, if we're being completely honest. So let's move on to our next slide. So I already mentioned some of this, but fullness comes from the relationship between size and weight. We can think of it kind of like a jar, like the jar being kind of like the space in our vocal tract. So if that space is big, you need kind of more stuff to kind of cram in and fill it. So if you have like a louder sound, then it sounds more normal, and lower pitches tend to kind of maybe be more like dense or something. So they kind of do have that effect as well. The kind of like inverse is if you have like a smaller size, and then if you're kind of like too loud or like too low in pitch, then it really will sound kind of like buzzy or off. So if you kind of come across like the stereotypical like T voice, a lot of the time it's because like this jar is kind of too small, and but the size in our vocal tract is too small, so we need to kind of open that space up. Now, we're generally looking for kind of like a balanced state. That's probably going to sound the most normal to people, but we do just want to be aware that like the way we find that might be a bit different depending on context. So sometimes it might mean you actually want to kind of go a little bit smaller, or you might want to kind of get a little bit louder, and like you might have to juggle things a little bit depending on the context you're in. So here's a tiny little graph. I couldn't find a digital version, so I just drew one myself. Very pretty, I'm sure. But on the left, we can see that kind of like we've got kind of like heavy, and we've got down at the bottom, we've got large. So average masculine tends to probably be like on the larger size and fairly heavy. Now, if we're thinking about like where androgynous voices might kind of fit into this picture, you might be tempted to think, oh, it must be like dead center. That's not quite the truth. There's actually kind of like different versions of androgyny. I know this is slightly off topic, but you can definitely produce variants in kind of like androgynous voices by honestly going to any probably point on this graph and kind of mixing things up a little bit. So like, I don't know, something like Shora's voice, if you know who that is. Her voice is like relatively heavy, but it's also on the smaller side. So it's probably somewhere kind of up in this direction somewhere, right? It's obviously not kind of like the most heavy voice ever, but it's also not kind of like over here. So you might find androgynous maybe up in this range of the voice, or, comparatively, you could find it maybe down here somewhere. So I feel like I've come across voices that maybe inhabit this sort of range sometimes, rarely. I can think of one person who fits that bill really, like Loic Notet. I'm not sure if anybody would know who that is, but he's like a Belgian singer. So you've definitely got some different versions of voices that can come from different places here, but most typically people are going to expect voices to fit along this midline, and that is generally what this kind of, this graph depicts, and what we're kind of probably expecting. If we're looking for masculine, we're probably going to want to move towards large and heavy. So what's up next? So fullness, we've got some other things to talk about. So we've got size, we've got weight, and that's kind of what fullness makes up for the most part. But like, what's up with pitch and volume? Because like, no conversations are really full, like complete, without kind of actually touching on those as well when it comes to fullness. So we mentioned how size is kind of relevant for kind of like, gendering a voice to some extent, right? And we've mentioned how weight kind of contributes to that. But you might notice if I'm trying to kind of like balance the like size and find something full at a higher pitch, then it's actually getting pretty loud, right? So mm, pitch and weight basically have a little bit of a kind of like strange relationship. So higher pitches tend to sound louder, but they also tend to have less weight in them, and lower pitches tend to sound quieter, but they tend to have more weight in them. So we've kind of got this situation where we are looking to kind of like find the right balance for the right situation. If you're pre-T, this becomes kind of especially relevant because like some people do find that it's kind of like easier to go large and kind of loud than it is to kind of go large and kind of low. But this means that like you don't want to kind of like put all of your eggs in the kind of like getting loud basket, because you know, if you're in a library or something, you're going to be asked to shut up, right? We need to kind of think about like what voices we can get away with in kind of what contexts, and kind of building to produce a kind of mixture that works. So I think I've covered basically everything on that slide. But yeah, basically we don't want to neglect the relevance of pitch, because it automatically kind of brings in weight, even if like sometimes that's not always the way we think about it. So what if we're thinking about kind of like modifying features in our voices? So the simplest way probably to kind of get a feeling for like modifying size, especially if you're kind of transmasc, is trying a yawn. Yawns tend to open up space in the vocal tract, and if we can try kind of maybe turning them into some different sounds. And we could even try maybe talking through a yawn. 1, 2, 3, 4. And if you've done that, you've probably changed size. Bonus points if you can kind of like jump back to a smaller size. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And that, if you can do that, you've kind of like, you've not mastered size. You could probably spend a little bit more time kind of like, you know, filling in the gaps and kind of building up some consistency there, maybe going vowel by vowel and things. But if you can do that, you've done a lot, right? You've kind of skipped the process. Now, if that didn't work for you, we do actually have some other stuff to try. So most people, as they go up in pitch, do tend to get a little bit smaller in size. So if you kind of started, you would probably end up going a little bit smaller as you did a slide up. So you can try looking for something smaller that way. And you could also try doing something like that's a similar sound, where you try going for like, I don't know, like a ghost noise or something like that. Right? Like, you know, similar-ish sounds, but sounding different. Right? I'm doing kind of different vowels. I kind of messed that demo up. One sec. If we can do something like that, where it's kind of sounding, you know, a little bit ghosty, a little bit larger, and kind of compare and contrast. It might be that you start on different vowels. You will eventually want to drift towards the same vowel, but you can try something similar where you kind of drift, where you kind of jump between the two sounds. And if you can kind of do something like that, you can try maybe adding some steps in between. Right, obviously this is a pretty high range. So what we can also kind of look towards is kind of bringing things down a little bit, and trying on a new pitch. And we can basically kind of build up our awareness from that, new vowels, and then maybe into new speech, and kind of just slowly building more awareness. You can start with, you know, big versus small. You can add an additional step in. You can add even more additional steps in. And the more you do that, the more refined your control becomes, and you can even move it into speech. I am talking with a smaller size, then I'm gradually moving to a larger size, right? So that kind of thing is something you can build towards. Let's jump forwards into our next slide. So what about vocal weight? So the simplest way for us to maybe do this to begin with is just like try doing a humming sound and see if we can be kind of softer, and see if we can try being louder. If we can do something like that, you know, that's pretty great. We can try kind of going back and forth along that continuum. We can try doing it on a continuous sound. And we can try kind of building from there into some speech and just seeing if we can kind of, get a little bit of awareness and a handle on it. So I'm talking softer, then I'm talking louder, then I'm talking softer again. This kind of like, just controlling it in speech. This is the kind of thing you're probably going to want to do if you're kind of like, on T, you've already got some changes going on. You're building control, you're building awareness, you're building agency basically. The picture will probably look a little bit different if you're pre-T and you're looking to change things, because in that scenario, you might want to build up a little bit more kind of like depth and range with regards to the weight change, rather than just working on purely creating weight change in the first place. Now, if we want to kind of like, oh, I didn't finish writing that slide, oopsie daisy. If we want to kind of do this at a kind of different pitch, then that's another way of kind of building up more awareness and control. So we could try going for a lower pitch, or we could even try going for a higher pitch, and we could try going from lighter to heavier, and then to lighter again. The more parts of our range we can kind of build up this control and awareness in, the more our ability grows. Now, here, this is actually supposed to say select one end of the spectrum, light or heavy, and then you want to maybe see if you can kind of like hold on to that kind of like, let's say, soft side, and then kind of move down through the range and move back up through the range. Then choose the heavy side and kind of move down through the range without letting it drop, and then kind of move back through. So basically kind of selecting kind of one end of that spectrum and holding on to it as you move through different parts of your range. Now, the way that kind of like spectrum feels in different parts of your range will probably be a little bit different. Like if I kind of start down here and I try to go to the heavy side of my range, and then I start kind of like trying to hold on to that, then it's going to be really loud in comparison to if I kind of found the heavy side of my range at a high point first, because chances are you're probably not going to default to yelling to kind of find it, right? So those are all some things you can kind of give a go. People in chat, do you want a second to play with any of those things, or are you content for me to move on? I'm not sure. How are you feeling? No pressure to respond. Okay. We've had one response, and that is to continue. So we shall do this. Now, what should we actually practice moving forwards? So things that might kind of like bear some relevance would be kind of like, lowering pitch and increasing weight. So talking with a heavy weight and a low pitch in a range that sounds kind of on the edge of effortful, but not kind of like to the point it's making sounds and stuff sound strange. So for me, that might kind of like look like something like this. I wouldn't want to try and like push it to the extreme where it's kind of sounding like out of control, and like we're looking for kind of like comfortable extreme to the point it's not kind of like completely derailing things. And we can spend time in that range until it starts feeling a little bit more normal, it feels a little bit more comfortable. Like if I kind of like spent a while kind of talking in this range, it'd probably be easier over time to access a similar range, and then maybe even like take things a little bit further as I grow increasingly familiar with that range. So it also has the benefit of like slightly encouraging like vocal fold growth and kind of like structure change if we are using kind of the extremes in that kind of rate. But we don't want it to be an uncomfortable extreme. We want it to be within the comfortable realm. So an additional kind of thing we can practice doing to try and increase our weight over time a little bit is something like hum and find like the heaviest sound we can. And just try and sustain that for as long as possible. We might find that we want to kind of like reduce. We might want to try and get like a little bit softer if we're not paying attention. So we might see something like if we saw something like that happen, we just want to kind of reaffirm our stance. We want to go in a little bit heavier again. And you try and add that kind of oomph back in, basically. Now, If we wanted to kind of like work on kind of like pitch and vocal weight at the same time, we could try kind of like sliding down in pitch and getting heavier. Oh no, I went into fry. What do I do? Right. But yeah, so we'd want to kind of like practice sliding down and maybe getting louder, more intense. But what we're looking to do is stop ourselves if we end up sliding into fry. If we end up in that sort of scenario, what we want to do is kind of stop before we get to that point. And hover kind of just above that range where it's wanting to happen. And then what we can try doing is kind of just like slide up and down a tiny bit. And hopefully over time we'll be able to slightly widen that kind of range we can that we can access before we start falling into that kind of trap of ending up just a little bit more likely to kind of end up in like, you know, a fryish kind of sound. So yeah, we can try just kind of like slowly exploring around that. Now, another kind of version of that is rather than going for something that's like, you know, a little bit fryish, we can kind of go almost the other way. We can try something like a yawn or a sigh, where we're maybe using more air, we're a little bit less likely to end up in fry. And the goal is just to kind of slide down slowly and gently, just as relaxed as we can be. We're not worrying about how much power we have in the voice. We're just trying to relax and take it slow and steady as far as we can. A lot of people find that when they kind of relax into a low pitch, they can actually get a little bit further than if they always go for the kind of like full on, all guns blazing kind of like heavy sound to begin with. It's almost kind of like two different approaches of kind of like reaching down for lower pitches. So like when we go for the heavier sound and we're kind of going for like louder and more intense, we're actually kind of like stiffening up the vocal folds. We're getting them to kind of be closer together, and more rigidity basically translates to kind of like lower pitches because they're more resistant to like, you know, vibrating basically. But if we go for the kind of relaxed sound, we're almost going from the other perspective. We're not kind of like holding them in a kind of rigid posture. We're not potentially kind of like accidentally tensing along the length of the vocal folds, which can kind of work in the opposite direction. So like sometimes we can accidentally raise pitch while we're trying to get louder. And I imagine that if people have tried to kind of increase weight, they've maybe come across that issue where they try to increase weight at some point and it starts going up in pitch. So this is kind of like, we're trying to avoid that particular problem with this kind of more relaxed state. But as we know, lower pitches inherently carry more weight in them. So what we're doing when we're relaxing is kind of allowing the vocal folds to relax. We're allowing the kind of tension to leave them. And we're just trying to like get as much as we can, almost without kind of like actively introducing stiffness to the vocal folds in a kind of more artificial way, which is what kind of can happen if we're trying to go for weighty. And again, if you find you're slipping into fry, we just want to hover just above where that's starting to happen. And we're going to slowly kind of like play around with the edge of where that's popping in. And we're just going to try and slowly over time increase the distance we can go before we fall into fry. So what's up next? So generally, we probably want to practice control of like size and resonance, especially in speech. So like, can you talk smaller? Can you kind of talk larger? Can we sort of like do that when we're starting with different levels of weight and pitch? So like, can you do it kind of down here and kind of modify things? Can you do it like down here and modify things? Can you do it up here and kind of modify things? Right, it's just kind of like building up control and awareness in that sort of sense. And like obviously not all of these sounds are going to be like equally as relevant and important to you. So you're going to want to spend the majority of your time in a zone that's of interest to you. So like, you know, this could be a kind of range that could be potentially interesting. but it kind of sounds maybe a little bit too small in this current iteration, so we probably want to try and go a little bit bigger. And then, if this sounds a little bit off, like what's wrong? Okay, it's sounding a bit hollow. I don't want to go smaller, but can I try to increase the weight a little bit? We might want to just make small little changes like this and kind of explore kind of the options and try stuff out, basically. So what else can we start doing at this kind of point? We can start thinking about all the kind of like speech patterns, the gender norms, and kind of like entrenched in speech, which are kind of separate from these things but not entirely, and the more stylistic features in voice. So what we can do for this is kind of like look for voices we like, and then rather than trying to like come up with our own speaking patterns, we can try copying. We can try kind of like copying the rhythm of the speech. So like some people will talk kind of quickly and not really pause between words. Other people will talk and have long gaps in between their words. Some people will hold out their words and talk with a slower kind of cadence, right? And, some of these things are gendered, some of them are just personal quirks, right? But you can kind of copy and explore, see what you like, see what kind of sounds more masculine to your ears, and kind of grow stuff from there. You can also think about pitch change, and we can also think about how not just kind of like the rate of speech and the kind of like flow of speech impacts kind of like the way people sound. The changes in pitch also impact that, and so does kind of like how the weight changes over time. So like some people might sound softer some parts of the sentence, but when they kind of want to emphasize something, they might kind of get a little bit weightier. So we're not necessarily looking to kind of like completely eliminate all variance. What we're looking is to probably reduce the amount of variance that there is in pitch and slightly increase the variance that there is in kind of like weight changes and potentially kind of rhythm of speech changes. But the most reliable way to get a feeling for that really is to find vocal role models that you like and voices that you like think sound good, because then you can at least know that you're not kind of like prescribing to kind of the gender norms of like a voice that's like 3/4 of the way around the world or something. Or if it is 3/4 of the way around the world, then at least you've chosen that rather than just kind of like borrowing like from rote. Oh yes, I must talk monotone now, right? So we can be a little bit more specific with our demands. So what else have we got? So if you're pre-T, then there are some kind of like precepts, some ideas that we can hold on to make, lowering pitch and gaining weight over time a little bit more of a likelihood to become reality rather than just kind of a stretch goal. So step one is kind of make a sustained effort. Don't just be a thing that you do like one day and then forget for a week and then come back to. Like you want to be doing it every day if you can. You want to maybe make a routine. So like when you wake up in the morning, a few hours later, again, a few hours later, a few hours later again, and find multiple opportunities to kind of do it. You might return to like similar exercises and things at different times of day, and you can kind of like work that in hopefully into your day so you're used to doing it and you're used to working on it. We can kind of like we'll want to kind of stop if things ever feel kind of like hoarse or strained or uncomfortable, because these sounds don't necessarily mean we're doing the right thing. Now this next comment here is like try to avoid mistaking kind of closure and weight with each other. I do have a little bit more info on that on the next slide, so we'll go over that then. But what are some things that we can kind of include in practice? So vocal warm-ups are a big thing. Doing kind of like things like lip trills and kind of maybe strong water, and just kind of like using vocal warm-ups as a tool as we kind of work on this is really useful. I'd especially recommend kind of like things like lip trills and strong water. I've already mentioned them, but like again, I especially recommend those because they have a little bit of a massaging effect on the voice, and the pitfalls that people sometimes run into with them are a little bit less likely when working on kind of increasing weight in the voice, because the pitfalls normally come in when we're actually trying to do the opposite. So what are some additional kind of things we can do to kind of like work on this, work on kind of increasing weight or lowering pitch over time? All the aforementioned stuff that we kind of mentioned here would still apply, but we also maybe want to try finding a heavy sound, and just sustaining that for as long as we can. If we start reducing, we want to bring it back, and practice holding on to that. Make sure it sounds comfortable, it doesn't sound rough, it doesn't kind of like get tickly or anything like that, but we're really trying to hold on to like the heaviest we can. Again, sliding down in pitch and getting heavier and heavier as we go, avoiding fry, and trying to make sure things sound smooth and feel comfortable. Sliding down in pitch in a relaxed way, already mentioned that, but it's important and useful. And practice at different times of day. Right when you wake up, right before you go to sleep, you'll probably find that your voice feels a little bit different, and you might actually be able to like learn things from this. There are some additional things we can try. So head tilting, like tilting the head up, can sometimes like encourage kind of like certain vocal behaviors to kick in, and then we can try finding something heavy while the head's tilted up, and then kind of tilting the head back down. That's an additional exploration to try. It can just kind of encourage a certain kind of like sound quality to pop in, and sometimes that can contribute to weight. I didn't mention it in the slides, but it's an additional kind of exploration to try, and I'd recommend you possibly insert that into your kind of like daily practices. See what the effect of neck and head posture is, and like if you find something that sounds heavier, can you kind of bring it back to roost, I guess. I don't know why I use that word. Actually, I do. So there is, I'm just going to mention it now while we're talking about head and neck posture, is that there is kind of like another kind of exercise that kind of goes the other way. So if we tilt the head up, then we tend to get weightier. But if we kind of keep the head kind of like straight forwards, and then like kind of scoot the head forwards, kind of like if we were kind of making a pecking motion almost, then like a chicken roost, making more sense now, then we can often end up actually reducing weight. So so that can kind of encourage a change like that, though not obligatory to try, but it might be like, whoa, why did that happen, if you do give it a try. But yeah, so let's move forwards. So closure and vocal weight, what's up with those two, what's going on? So vocal weight, as we kind of mentioned before, is kind of like this kind of warm, full quality to some extent. So this is kind of like weightier, right? And so would this be, right? So what we can also kind of like think about is like, what is closure? So like taken to an extreme, closure might sound something like this, right? Like this is like super extreme. It kind of like pushes us towards kind of like fry as well. So like fry normally comes in when there's a decent amount of closure going on, right? So it's kind of like associated maybe with weight, but it's not quite the same thing, because like we can have kind of like good closure, or like fairly closed out kind of sounds without the weight being really, really high as well. So it's kind of like sometimes people kind of mistake the two, because like this kind of sounds pretty weighty, and then if I add more closure in, there's almost like it kind of sounds a little bit more buzzy, right? But we can hopefully hear that there's a bit of a distinction between the two. Normally, I would say that when you're working on this stuff, you don't want to go overboard on closure. It can be tempting. So like, for example, when you go for the weightier sound, people can be tempted to kind of clamp up a little bit to try and like make the sound continue. Rather than clamping up, we kind of want to see if we can actually get there almost in different ways. Like it can contribute to the buzz, but it doesn't have this same like full quality to it. It probably won't contribute to this like fullness in the voice. Rather, it just kind of like make sure the voice doesn't sound hollow. It makes sure the voice doesn't sound kind of like fadey outy, for lack of a better descriptor, but it doesn't necessarily help keep things kind of all together in a kind of way that sounds more masculine. So like if I have a like large size and then I kind of like introduce more closure, it doesn't actually make the voice sound necessarily more masculine. It gives this more kind of like teenage boy kind of trying too hard quality, rather than kind of like a kind of like adult guy's voice kind of quality. So you can definitely lean on closure to some extent, but if it goes too far, it'll probably make you sound younger rather than making you sound more masculine. So it can also kind of encourage all of these kind of things. So it can make your voice sound rough, it can make you sound strained, it can make you sound buzzy, it can encourage creak or fry. And like, sometimes if it's kind of like, yeah, it can sound a little bit kind of like holding your breath almost, like you're not using almost enough air. So like if I kind of have like good, like, maybe like a bunch of closure and then I add tons of air, then it maybe sounds a little bit more like this, right? Like I'm throwing air at the problem. So it kind of gets like almost more buzzy, but it doesn't necessarily sound kind of like full even then when we kind of throw more air at the issue. We're kind of like looking normally where we can for a more balanced state. So I think this is the final slide. Yeah. So vocal health, let's talk about this here. So in many ways, right, especially when we're thinking about closure from our last slide here, it can be a little bit more taxing on the voice. So voice masculinization, we do tend towards more closure, and that does tend to encourage a little bit more roughness in the voice. We want to be careful for that reason, but we also want to just kind of make sure that like we're paying attention. Like if things feel scratchy or tense or hoarse, that's normally a sign that we want to kind of like pull back a little bit on exactly what we're doing there. Maybe take a little bit of a break, maybe come back to it a little bit later and see if we can like approximate similar sounds, but without kind of the discomfort and tension that we maybe have been bringing into the voice up to that point. So again, I'm going to mention lip trills and straw and water here. So the main problem with lip trills and straw and water that people sometimes run into is that if they're going for a lip trill, sometimes they'll make a change, and they'll kind of end up kind of fading out. They'll end up getting airy. When we're doing sounds like this, we really, really, really want to avoid kind of fading out and kind of getting airy. This is kind of a situation where the closure is opened up too much. It's not kind of doing enough. So whenever we're doing this, like softies or straw and water, or like the lip trill rather and straw and water, we want to try and go for that full-on kind of like non-airy, but also not too closed up side of things. We want a balanced middle state. And we maybe want to kind of like slide up and down in terms of pitch. We might want to try for the heavier sounds. So this would be starting with something heavier, right? So again, we're just we're just going for kind of like a comfy enough sound. We're looking for smooth, consistent, but we're going for a lip trill because it is a very beneficial thing for the voice. So the reason why I'm recommending these two softies over others in particular is because the air pressure changes, the kind of thing that's happening, the kind of like almost like building up pressure, blowing the lips out, kind of closing up again, this kind of back and forth actually has a little bit of a massaging effect on the vocal folds themselves and kind of can aid with vocal recovery. And I think the pressure changes also help kind of build resilience and consistency when it comes to managing closure in a way that kind of like some lighter sounds often don't to the same extent. So that's kind of why I'd like encourage these in particular. So, again, look out for kind of air leaky kind of sounds. Anything like that, where it's kind of like changing the timbre of the lip trill. So like you can hear that. That kind of, it's gone airy, right? So we want to look out for that kind of thing. Now, you can also try to work in some vocal warm-ups more generally. It's just useful practice. You can kind of view vocal warm-ups as vocal coordination practice, and depending on the exact type you do, it can be useful going forwards. I'm not going to go into too much detail because that could kind of be a whole almost workshop on its own. But Yeah, what else? What other last things do I really want to mention here? Avoid leaving voice related medical stuff untreated. So, like acid reflux. If you're worried you have nodules or something like that, don't just kind of like jump into voice training and completely ignore these things. Try and get whatever the problem is sorted to whatever extent is feasible. Um, reduce and avoid smoking, drinking, excessive caffeine intake, vaping, blah, blah, blah. All of these kind of things that we know are a little bit bad for us, but we might be tempted to ignore. Just try to look after your voice basically in that regard. Don't ignore pain if it shows up. Pain is normally a signal that we're doing something that's hurting us. And, if something hurts, we really don't want to allow that particular thing to become habit, because that's when it often becomes a real problem. So, reduce exposure to any contaminants where possible, things like smoke, mold, exhaust, all these different kind of contaminants that we can run into our day-to-day lives. Um, if you can reduce the incidence with which you're coming into contact with them, or like if you can wear a mask when you're in contact with them, that's probably for the best. Stay hydrated, always really nice. The full effects of hydration aren't really felt until 4 hours after you've drunk. So staying hydrated throughout the day is better than kind of like chugging a liter in 10 minutes before voice practice. Though yeah, 10 minutes probably isn't even enough to feel the effects. 20 minutes is when you really start feeling any effects at all. And finally, the last thing I want to say is like, don't allow yourself to become a vocal underdoer. If you're applying the other kind of voice training stuff we mentioned here, where you're trying to like work on kind of like lowering pitch and weight over time, that's pretty unlikely to happen. But generally, general advice to literally everybody would be to try and spend your voice for at least an hour a day, because otherwise you risk reducing or kind of like losing vocal function to some degree. But yeah, that's it for our kind of PowerPoint. Does anybody have any questions like about stuff we went over? Does anybody have any questions more generally? Yeah. Do, 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 do. I notice when working on larynx height and size, I'll get the sudden urge to yawn that takes me a moment or two to suppress. Is that something that will go away with time, or is that something I can actively do to discourage it? So, my suggestion for this, like most reliably, would be to try and associate most of your like working on like size and larynx height practice stuff with speech, because it's less likely to pop in if you kind of like are speaking, but it also doesn't always like seem super strange if it pops in if you have a yawn while speaking. So like if currently you're doing exercises and the like to kind of work on those kind of aspects of voice, then it can be good to kind of like see if you can, again, kind of like practice modifying these things in speech itself. So like if you're moving from smaller to kind of like larger over the course of a sentence, or kind of moving from smaller to kind of medium to kind of large, maybe even larger than that, and kind of doing it almost like in a speaky way, you're a little bit less likely to have it trigger than if you do something like trying to manually manipulate the posture of things, like by focusing on the muscles, or by kind of like using a whisper exercise and all of these kinds of things. Again, working on vowel sounds individually is maybe slightly more likely to trigger things. So like uh 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 maybe a little bit more likely to trigger a yawn, but isn't like as inherently likely to as like something like trying to work on muscle posture on its own, or trying to work on like it through the form of whispering and stuff like that. Um, and to make it even less likely to happen, like if you find like a mixture that you like, uh, uh, so like maybe you kind of like found a voice that you kind of like liked in the kind of like midterm, just spending time using that voice, and like making sure, like being a little bit kind of conscious that like you're using it, and like hopefully not yawning every 2 seconds. If you can kind of get into the habit of speaking in that range without the yawns popping in, they're probably less likely to kind of pop in again when you revisit that voice later. So kind of like once your body and brain's kind of desensitized a little bit to using that kind of like range and kind of like version of your voice, it's a lot less likely for it to pop in than if you were just kind of like practicing periodically. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. Do either of you have any other questions you wanted to ask? Okay. And Boba, did you have any questions? If you're here. So stiffness in this context literally refers to like the vocal folds themselves. So if you picture the vocal folds kind of like a guitar string or something, you know how the thick strings are kind of stiff. They're like stiffer than the thin strings, and they're like more resistant to kind of posture change. They're also thicker, but they're also stiffer. So when we like, this is where the analogy breaks down a little bit, but if we have like closure, right, and we kind of cram the vocal folds a little bit closer together, the kind of like proximity and kind of pressure can kind of make them a little bit less likely to vibrate as quickly. So it can kind of like come through that kind of route, but it can also come through like more tension in the vocal folds, basically, if you think about it, is in some ways likely to make them a little bit less prone to kind of vibrating back and forth, because like if you can imagine, it's harder to get something to move if it's kind of like more tense, basically. So we kind of have like stiffness kind of like can impede basically the rate of kind of vocal fold vibration, uh, because it's kind of like, so it can basically lower pitch because it's literally like the vocal folds themselves are more stiff. It's like flexing a piece of paper versus flexing a piece of card. It's going to be a little bit easier to do it with a piece of paper than a piece of card. Um, mm, Potentially. I'm not sure if I've come across people describe falsetto as stiff. Um, so I'm not too confident in weighing in on that particular descriptor because I don't know how people are using that description. Um, but I could potentially see it kind of like something like that doesn't feel particularly like, I mean, it's not necessarily, yeah, actually I probably doubt that it's used in the same way. I could be wrong, but like I'm assuming maybe stiff means like hard to move around in terms of pitch. It doesn't necessarily mean it's hard to move around in pitch. Like it can maybe have that effect to some extent. But like mm, yeah, I don't know. I'd rather not weigh in on this because I'm not too sure, to be honest. Stiff in different ways. Okay, yeah. I think I'm not sure if I completely know what the singers are referring to with descriptions like stiff. Um, no shade on singers or anything. Just not something I've looked into as much recently. And like terminology can jump around wildly when it comes to singing stuff. Um, so yeah, Boba, did you have any other questions? Uh, okay, in that case, one thing you can try doing is kind of like slightly increase the airflow. Like if you're having trouble not bringing a fry when trying to increase weight, you can slightly try to increase the airflow and see if that has any impact. The other option really is to kind of like maybe try going for like a slight, yeah, like you can try going for an area, kind of like weighty sound. So like, if that kind of makes sense. So like starting with a sigh or something, it's a little bit kind of like less controlled probably, and we don't necessarily want to go too far with it because it's not always comfortable. Um, but that might be another way of kind of slightly avoiding the fry and making it a little bit less likely to pop in. Well, normally the biggest indicator is just going to be whether your pitch is moving around. Technically, other things do impact volume, but when you change volume on a single set pitch, like 9/10 of that is coming from a weight change. So, like, it's not, it's like not technically 100%, but like the vast majority is coming from like weight change. Some of it's coming from the effective closure, some of it's coming from resonance posture, but like most of it is coming from weight. So I would say it's not worth worrying about too much. That's just my stance, though. I'm sure other teachers have their own opinions. Um, but yeah. Okay, no more questions. Do either of you want any one-to-one time reminder this is being recorded? Okay, fair enough, fair enough. Um, did you have any stuff? I think your username is like 1000, right? Like, did you have any stuff? Like, did you want to do any one-on-one stuff, or are you all right? Okay, in that case, what I'll do is I shall stop the recordings here.